I'm Owen, and I'm dying. I am Wilfred, and I follow the gleam. These lines were written by First World War poet Wilfred Owen in a letter to his beloved friend and mentor Siegfried Sassoon on the 27th of November 1917, less than a year before he would be killed in action. His death, 1 week before armistice, would see the end of one of the greatest literary talents of the 20th century. Widely considered to be the greatest poet of the First World War, Owen was an innovator, experimenting with pararhyme and assonance to create poetry that had the emotive power of Romanticism, but moved in the new realistic direction of modernism. Wilfred Edward Salter Owen was born in Shropshire in 1893 to Susan and Thomas Owen. He was the first of their 4 children and initially lived at his mother's ancestral home of Plas Wilmot. His mother's family were well loved and respected, with Wilfred's grandfather serving as mayor at one point. His father Thomas's origins were much more humble. However, in 1897, when Wilfred's grandfather died, the family was forced to sell their ancestral home and all the precious articles within, effectively erasing the memory of their once respectable standing. Susan and Thomas then moved to much less luxurious accommodation and relocated several times due to Thomas's job as a station worker. The family were by no means poor, being able to afford a maid during these times, but they were not in the position they used to be and would probably have faced some prejudice and insecurity from being on the lower end of middle class. Something which we can see affected Wilfred into his adulthood. It was during childhood, however, that Owen discovered his love for poetry, falling in love with the Romantic poets, in particular John Keats, whose work he felt was the pinnacle of poetic achievement. By all accounts, he was an inquisitive and intelligent child who did very well in school. As a young man, he worked as an assistant to the Vicar of Reading to earn money for tuition. This enabled him to take an exam to attend the University of London. He passed the exam but failed to get the scholarship, and so instead went to France to teach at a languages school in Bordeaux. While there, he befriended a famous French poet called Laurent d'Alhade, who took him under his wing. When war was declared in 1914, he didn't rush to enlist, but went back to England in 1915 to join the Artists' Rifles. Later on, he became an officer in the Manchester Regiment and was immediately plunged into the atrocities of winter warfare in the trenches. Wilfred's wartime experiences were harrowing, even by normal frontline standards. By the time he arrived at the front, the Manchesters had already suffered heavy losses at the Somme. Owen's first job was to hold a continuously flooding dugout on the front line for 2 days, standing in freezing knee-deep water, being shot at and shelled, as many of his men were being violently ill. He admitted afterwards that he'd been tempted to let himself drown. His company then went straight back into action, where they encountered masses of dead bodies, frozen preserved by the cold. On their journey they were pinned down by shelling. For 2 days and nights they waited, with no water, because all their water had frozen solid. One of Owen's men tragically froze to death, and Owen himself contracted frostbite, a severe cold, and dysentery as a result of drinking snow water. In March 1917, he rejoined the front once more, this time falling into a 15-foot hole one night while searching for a sick man, hitting the back of his head and suffering a concussion so severe that he was unable to move or call for help for an entire day and night. When he was finally rescued, he was past fit for duty with a slight concussion. However, a few days later he was violently sick while in the front-line trenches, suffering with muscle pain and a high fever. His concussion was worse. When he had recovered from this, he was conscious of the fact that his nerves had not, and found himself having to make excuses to his mother for his shaky handwriting. Returning to the front in April, Wilfred joined his men on a recently captured hill. He said of this time that, "I kept alive on brandy and the fear of death." His company was eventually relieved, but on their way back they fell victim to a cloud of mustard gas, an ordeal recounted in his poem Dulce et decorum est. One of his men was too slow in getting his gas mask on, and Wilfred had to watch him die, powerless to help. Though near his breaking point, there would be no reprieve for Owen yet. For a few days later he would have to lead the survivors in an offensive, walking across no man's land, straight into the oncoming fire. 30 of his men would die. He described what he saw to his brother. I looked back and saw the ground all crawling and wormy with wounded bodies. His company regrouped and were ordered to capture a trench under heavy sniper fire. They did this and were then forced to hold the trench for 9 days because there was no one to relieve them. It was during this tense period that the final blow came for Owen's nerves. One night as he was sleeping, a shell exploded a few yards from his head, throwing him up into the air and knocking him unconscious. When he came to, he saw that the shell had blown the body of one of his fellow officers out of its grave, where he'd been buried over a week prior, and scattered it around him. This episode caused him to develop symptoms similar to that of his concussion. He was fit enough, however, to appear on parade on the 30th of April, where his Colonel Luxmore handed command over to Major Dempster, a man that had taken a dislike to Owen, deeming him not of a high enough class to be an officer. His first move to assert himself in this new role was to publicly berate and humiliate Owen by suggesting that he was a coward. Owen was shipped back to England as a shell-shock case, one of the most humiliating circumstances a First World War soldier could find himself in. Owen's shame is evident in his sudden vagueness of his condition when writing to his mother. Eventually he was sent to Edinburgh, to a neurasthenic hospital called Craiglockhart, which would turn out to be one of the key moments of his life. For throughout the war, Owen had never forgotten his love of poetry, and as well as writing it, he kept up to date with the new war poetry being published. One of his favourite new poets was a man named Siegfried Sassoon, who had recently become a bit of a celebrity with his famous declaration against the war that was read out in the House of Lords. Owen admired his poetry greatly and owned several copies of his latest poetry anthology. It must have seemed like providence when Sassoon was sent to the same hospital as him, Craiglockhart, in response to his inflammatory protest. After Sassoon arrived, Owen bided his time, waiting a month until he worked up the courage to go to his rooms and ask for an autograph. The two developed a very intimate friendship, which many have speculated was much more than just a friendship. Sassoon would be one of Owen's biggest promoters, helping to publicise his friend's work and also inadvertently helping to heal much of the damage done to Owen's nerves and confidence. Owen's relationship with Sassoon was one of hero worship. He idolised the man, and finding him to be a highly sympathetic, caring and kind friend didn't help matters. Imagine meeting your hero and finding out that they not only like you, but absolutely believe in you, are prepared to do everything they can to help you, share the same thoughts, opinions, and secret sexual inclination as you, and that on top of that they actually genuinely love and care about you. When you consider all this, it isn't surprising how quickly and how deeply Owen and Sassoon's relationship developed. They had the absolute best of each other. Owen could provide purpose and assurance to Sassoon, and Sassoon could provide help and confidence to Owen, a role he thrived in more than any other. The pair enjoyed a blissful but far too short few months together in Craiglockhart, writing some of the greatest poetry either had ever written. Anthem for Doomed Youth and Dulce et Decorum Est, two of Owen's most famous poems, were written during this time, with suggestions and alterations by Sassoon. Owen was deemed fit for light duties in November and had to leave. The letter he writes to Sassoon to say goodbye is very telling of the intensity of their relationship. In it, he openly declares his love for Sassoon, with very strong tones of hero worship and gratitude. Sassoon also included a photograph of himself, which Owen had asked for and later had framed. After the two parted, Owen was noticeably moody, and a fellow officer that served with Owen, Canon H.R. Bate, describes him in his memoirs as being hypersensitive, aloof, withdrawn and solitary, and states that he was nicknamed the Ghost due to this. For the time being, however, Owen was safe in England, and Sassoon made it clear to him that he would like him to stay that way. But Sassoon was sent back to the front only a few months later, and suffered a bullet to the head by friendly fire, which put him out of the war. Wilfred went to see him during his recovery, and Sassoon recollected that they spent the whole of a hot, cloudless afternoon together. It would be the last time they would see each other. Owen must have known then that he would go back to the front. Following his hero's example, he wished to prove his bravery once and for all, and perhaps most tragically, wanting to prove it and his worthiness to his friend. He hid his decision to go back to the front from Sassoon because he knew how adamantly his friend would object. Sassoon had actually threatened to stab Owen in the leg if he should try to go back, a desperate plea that fell on deaf ears. Instead, Owen waited to inform Sassoon of his decision when he was already back on the front lines and nothing could be done to save him. This letter to Sassoon, breaking the ice, is very telling of their relationship. Saturday, the 31st of August 1918, to Siegfried Sassoon. Goodbye, dear Siegfried. I'm much nearer to you here than in Scarborough, and am by so much happier. I have been incoherent ever since I tried to say goodbye on the steps of Lancaster Gate. But everything is clear now, and I'm in hasty retreat towards the front. Battle is easier here, and therefore you will stay and endure old men and women to the end, and wage the bitterer war, and more hopeless. What more is there to say that you will not better understand unsaid? Your Wilfred Edward Owen. In one of his letters during the last few months of his life, he actually tells Sassoon that he was following his example by going back to the front, something which must have haunted him. He also asks him to go and visit his mother if he should be killed, something which Sassoon did. Owen's final letters to his mother, however, remained much more hopeful. When Wilfred Owen did tragically die on the 4th of November 1918, his mother would receive the news on Armistice Day, as the church bells were ringing out in celebration of the end of the war. Sassoon would not receive word of his death for months afterwards. Wilfred Owen was just 25 years old at the time of his death, the same age that Keats, his poetic idol, died. He hadn't survived to see any of his work published, or his bravery certified by the military cross he was awarded posthumously after his death. His mother would wear it round her neck for the rest of her life. After his death, Sassoon and other friends would work hard to promote Wilfred and see that he got the fame that he deserved. In later years, Sassoon would admit that Wilfred's death was an unhealed wound, a chasm in my private existence, and that I wanted him back, not his poetry. He also destroyed many of the letters Owen sent him to protect him, leading people to speculate that there were more love letters between the two. Towards the end of his life, Sassoon had dreams that Wilfred had come back to him and that they were writing poetry together again.